Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with musician, historian, and author of Jamil Nasser's 2018 book called Upright Bass, The Musical Life and Legacy. This is his son, Muneer Nasser. He talked about his life and music and his latest 2019 CD, A Soldier's Story. And his new book chronicles the evolution of his father as a young bassist on Beale Street to a top-flight bassist on the New York City jazz scene. Miles Davis always harbored curiosity that produced an environment that made these musicians like Jamil come out and be a part of New York. His narrative captures the untold stories of two piano giants, Phineas Newborn and Oscar Dennard. He also shares anecdotes about his mentors, Papa Joe Jones, Lester Young, Charles Mingus, Oscar Pettiford, and the great Ray Brown. So get to know him and dig this interview, my friends.
Right at the top of this, I just want to thank you for reaching out to this phenomenally, very well-needed book. As you could very well tell by what we do around here, etching the stories and biographies of this rich history of jazz is a very important thing to do.
Especially before a lot of these cats leave, because they take a lot of information to the grave. That's the greatest jazz library in the world.
Yeah, without a doubt. And your music is phenomenal. I really enjoyed the disc and enjoy your music. So I want to delve both into your father and you and the tapestry of both of you in jazz. So, again, thank you for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz. I appreciate it.
Yes, you're welcome.
So let's go ahead and dive right in here. And before we get into your father and the book, I kind of want to get an idea of you, who you are and where your beginnings were and how it all began for you.
Okay, I was born June 3rd, 1967. I'm the third of six children. Started out music real early because my father always took us to the concerts. Some of the earliest memories is him playing with Ahmed Jamal in mid-70s, 74, 75. He left the group in 76. And so that created an interest in learning how to play music, especially when he took me to see Dizzy Gillespie at the Village Gate. And so we were around the music, hearing it live, talking to the musicians, you know, going to the rehearsals. So that naturally created a desire in me to want to pursue music. But when I saw the economic returns, it kind of created this element of doubt. So I ended up, you know, going to Howard University, which brought me to Washington, D.C. And although I was studying international business, I fanned out into this great jazz community here in Washington because we had a lot of great musicians here too. And so I started a family here and continued to play my music, you know, worked various day jobs to keep body and soul together, keep the family eating. That's about it.
Right on. So before we get into the book that you authored, The Musical Life and Legacy of Jamil Nasser, I want to talk to you about A Soldier's Story, which is your newest CD that came out along with the book. You know, the way I roll, I'm kind of old school, I guess. I put the CD in the car and I drive and I listen and I ponder. And I've had, and it seems weird that that's old school, but it is. And I've really enjoyed listening to that CD and what you've etched together. So talk to me about this project.
Well, I've been wanting to do a CD for a long time. And so finally I was able to procure a grant from the Montgomery County Arts Council to actually do this CD. And one of the things I wanted to do, it seems like the music is getting away from pulse and swinging. That's one of the things that attracted me to jazz, with the feeling. You could pat your foot, you could dance, you know. And so I felt the music kind of straying from that, getting a little bit more loose metered and cerebral. So I just kind of wanted to bring it back to the jazz I grew up with. And I've been told that that's kind of reminiscent of like Woody Shaw, who I got to see a lot. And so I have a foot in the, you know, the bebop of Charlie Parker, but I also like the modern twist that of McCoy Tyner and Woody Shaw. And that's when I was going out to hear the music. That's what it sounded like. In fact, my father bought me Rosewood. So I was able to meet Woody Shaw. And so I wanted to have a musical component to the book because I just didn't want to just reflect on the past. I wanted to also document my involvement in the music as well. So to have one foot in the past and one foot in the present, moving towards the future. And so I tried to gather the greatest musicians in this area. James King, of course, is Gary Bartz's regular bass player. Our drummer, John Lampkin Jr., plays with Benny Golson. Alan Johnson is a very prominent pianist, particularly in this area. He directs the UDC, University of District Columbia, the college here in D.C. He directs the big band, which he inherited from Calvin Jones, another great Memphis musician that played trombone and led the band. And Elijah Easton is awesome. This cat is 28 years old, playing tenor like that.
Wow.
You hear the mature sound he has? This guy was born in 1991. You know what I'm saying? He's playing like a man 50 years old. And so we had a good chemistry and a good rapport, and I'm pleased with the result. Everything just came together. I'm trying to, keep that group working if I can.
If there was any genre where there's a lot of old souls that shine, jazz is definitely that realm.
Yes. But it's so difficult now because just the changes, even with technology, it seems like jazz has become invisible. I mean, radio stations have scaled back, so it has a minimal presence. Even here, when I came to D.C. in January of 1988, then there's a 24-hour jazz station and another one. We had two jazz stations, WPFW and DCU. And once that radio station, DCU, closed down, it changed the whole landscape of the jazz scene. Because what that did, that would bring somebody that otherwise wouldn't listen to jazz. They would be driving through this crazy rush hour traffic here. And that converted a lot of people to come out to the clubs, to listen to the music. And so when we lost that, it kind of tanked and went down. And then I think, in this current environment, these younger people, if they can't pat their foot and be involved, they're out of there.
Yeah.
And I've been in jazz club, the music was good, and they came in and they stayed for half a tune and they were gone,
Yeah.
So I think we have to discuss changing the performance paradigm. Using technology, using visuals, because we have a more visual-oriented, audience now than the ones in the past, So I know everybody wants to think there's a ready-made jazz thing like my father came into, coming from Memphis to New York. That's far from the case. Everybody has to be a jazz educator and recruiter now to grow the music. My father was calling out trying to organize the musicians, trying to get them to take more responsibility for the business, try to get out the clubs into the concert halls. And I don't think this generation has any particular mission other than being on the bandstand playing and just posting on Facebook. And there's a lot of other work to be done other than that.
Yeah.
And I don't really see us advancing the music to the next level, but we have a contribution, I think, to make in documenting the music and taking more control of the business. I think that's the mission of the current generation,
Yeah.
And so I don't think we've undertaken, the responsibility of moving that forward. I know my father was discussing this years. He was calling Mayday, jazz is dying, and he was trying to organize the musicians, and it was kind of difficult. People would come and they would listen, but when it came time for follow-up, they were nowhere to be found. Those guys had a creative voice off the bandstand. That's why it's great to write books when you could capture not somebody speaking for them, but their voice.
Yeah.
There's a book out on a prominent saxophone, but it's not written in his voice. In fact, his words are smaller than the author's.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
and
totally.
so you deprive of their voice off the horn. And sometimes that's just as dynamic and creative as their voice being projected from the instrument itself. And a lot of times we lose that because the music, the story's not being written in their voice. If you ever been around musicians backstage talking, man, a lot of them are just as engaged and off the bandstand as they are on it, and the stories continue backstage. A lot of colorful, profound stories of, dealing with the elder musicians, and like my father talking about Lester Young and certain things he said and passed on and certain predictions he had about the direction of the music. Because they could see stuff. They could see stuff coming, around the corner years before, especially Lester Young and Papa Joe. They were like musical prophets in a certain sense.
Wow. Yeah,
and so my father was always a storyteller. If you ever met him, and you talk to anybody who met him and knew him, he was always on the radio giving interviews. He was trying to educate people about the music. So he did, an equal, if not greater amount of activity off the bandstand and on.
Right on. Well, I want to talk to you about this book. I mean, your father played with Phineas Newborn, Lou Donaldson, Red Garland, as you mentioned, Ahmad Jamal, so many names. You know, he was in it for 50-plus years. He was an African-American that converted to the Muslim faith. There were so many things that were a part of him that were already could be problematic for him. He was overcoming. So talk to me a little bit about how the construction of this book happened, how it started, and how it came into fruition. We're talking about the physical copy today.
Okay, so my father he collect all kinds of reviews and articles about the music, and he always envisioned writing a book. He always would say, I'm gonna put the real story of my life in a book and my interactions and experiences on the New York jazz scene. But he never got a chance because Alzheimer's started creeping up on him. He knew something was happening, so I got a distress call from my stepmother saying, your father's not acting right, because a lot of times their behavior changes. And so she wanted me to come up there immediately, because as a consequence of his activity off the bandstand and challenging the jazz industry, work dried up for him, and he was frustrated. And so we thought he needed something to do to lift his spirits and occupy his time, and I recommended the memoir. But before I started it, I said, are you sure you want to do this? You think this is important? And he said yes. And from right there, we went into interviewing Buster Smith, who was in the New York Jazz Quartet, who died 30 days, maybe 90 days after our last interview. He was a treasure trove of information. I mean, what people were wearing, their exact words, And so we had a series of interviews with him because he really wanted to document Oscar Dennard. I mean, I'm happy about to reveal the Phineas Newborn story, but Oscar Dennard is one of the most obscure musicians in jazz history. And so we started documenting, his experiences with Oscar Dennard first. That's where we started, and then we fanned out from there, backwards and forwards. But it's something that he wanted to do on his own, but he realized that, his capacity was diminishing. He could feel that. So he passed the baton to me. And I went to Howard and I had a kind of a writing history. I used to write for the Hilltop, which was our campus newspaper that was founded incidentally by Zora Neale Hurston. I just found that out a few months ago, that she founded that paper, the Hilltop, on Howard's campus. And so, I had to go into another school mode because I tried some editors and they had some strange ideas. I had to fire 2 or 3 of them, and I had to take that upon myself. So I had to immerse myself in the study of grammar and a whole bunch of other things to bring that about, because it's self-published. I just didn't want to go through the filter of the editors because they have different ideas of what they want. And for them, it's not about telling the true authentic history. It's about selling books. So anything that would inhibit that true, false, or in between, it's going to go. So when you sign with a traditional publisher, they give you the check. It's their book. They have final say on everything. And that's what I wanted to avoid.
Yeah.
And in spite of all that history, his death wasn't documented by the New York Times. It wasn't documented by the Jazz Times, the Washington Post. And I've seen them have obituaries for roadies that clean the bus and set up the equipment for some groups.
Wow.
So basically, we knew that, though. We weren't shocked. That was the book was a preemptive strike because we knew that was coming. And I think I said that in the preface. You know what I'm saying? That, he was overlooked in his lifetime, and we knew it wasn't going to be any different when he left here. And so that's why we went about the process of documenting this history. Even the story of Phineas Newborn. He was a pianist that played great and went crazy. That's a narrative we've been hearing for how many years? Yeah. For the last 30, 40, 50 years. And he knew the real story, which he revealed in interviews, but an interview is not a book. There's other stuff. As you see, I put documentation and other articles and stuff like that complement and expand and even offer, verification for certain aspects of their, experiences. And that's important, The oral history is fine, but we need to do a lot more writing. If you believe Freddie Hubbard's 10 years in the grave and there's not even a faint rumbling about a book on him or a document. And I love Buddy Bolden, that's fine. Well, what about the history we're closest to? We got we have more of a chance of capturing an accurate depiction of Freddie Hubbard in film or books than Buddy Bolden.
Yep.
We should still know about him, but it seems like the example I use, we walk past our grandmothers to learn about the ancient history of Africa.
Yeah.
Why don't you start? You know what I'm saying? Charity begins at home and then spreads abroad. Try to understand your experiences here and then work your way back. But by the time we figure that out, guess what? They were dead. It's too late then. And so you have to act in a timely manner. And just like this year alone, Willie Thomas died, great trumpeter, educator. I interviewed him, Calvin Newborn. He's an ancestor. Not this year, but last year. Between this year and last year. And Randy Weston. That's 3 people right there I interviewed for the book. They're gone.
Yeah.
And they were in their 80s or close to their 80s then. See? So a lot of this is time sensitive. And I tell all the audience I stand before, can you believe that Roy Haynes is 94 and nobody has documented his 70-plus years experience in jazz?
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about an interview because I had an argument with John Haskey from the Smithsonian about this. He's like, well, no, we got an oral history. That's not a book. In my father's last interview with Phil Schaap in 2001, he said it's going to take a book to really bring home the story of Oscar Dennard and their experiences in Poland, Russia, and North Africa. Which jazz ambassador books and the books on jazz diplomacy, they didn't exist. They never went to Russia, nor did Mitchell and Ross. And so like Monk, have you ever read a book on Monk where they said my father played with him for a week in May of 1972? I had to call Robin Kelly, said, you missed something. He said, what? I said, my father worked a whole week with Monk.
Yeah.
Paul Jeffrey would see me and say, hey, man, for 10, 15 years. That was his pleading. Your father tell you we worked with Monk? He said, well, I talked to Paul Jeffrey for 10 hours. Your father's name never came up.
Huh.
And he was on the gig for a whole week.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's filling these significant, gaps. They said that the bass player, I'm trying to think of him, that played with Monk for a little while. Man, his name's on the tip of my tongue. If I could think of it, I can't really think of it right now. But he was given credit for 2 weeks, with Monk at the Aqua Lounge. So just stuff like that. The Memphis in May Festival. They started that, and you Google that, you might find, if you dig deep enough, you might find the New York Times article I included that tells you how it was really started. But other than that, it just came out of the ether, according to them. And I interviewed Jim Hall, and he said jazz is not a viable draw for the festival. And I get that, but you still stand on the foundation of jazz and blues. So why not acknowledge it in some kind of way? Guess who's headlining Memphis in May this year? Cardi B. That's ridiculous. They would never invite Willie Nelson to the Reggae Sunsplash. Right?
Wow. Yeah.
They're not going to invite a reggae group to an Irish Celtic festival. You know what I'm saying? But anybody could be jazz now. It's just a general term that can apply to rappers, country and western artists, And so that's another thing that's kind of disappointing about now.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to document the history because my father was always, giving interviews and lectures. That was just as much a part of his legacy as anything musically, and especially the Jazz Foundation stuff too. That kept people alive, literally.
Yeah.
Free operations, free medical care. They deliver food to people. They pay their rent. Some of these great musicians you listen to, they were on the brink of being evicted from their homes.
Yeah.
Cecil Payne was sitting drinking Slim Fast because he didn't have food. The great Cecil Payne,
Wow.
who Ron Carter points out even now in his interviews, that's one of his main influences. Cecil Payne and J.J. Johnson on how to play bass. They taught him how to play bass from their instruments. And this man almost starved to death, literally. And so look at Dave Valentine. I remember, I'm 51, I remember Dave Valentine was big, biggity big. You couldn't listen to a jazz radio station for an hour without hearing his flute. And all of a sudden he had a stroke and he became a nobody. And that's happened to so many people in this music. And so he was really gratified to, to serve the fellow musicians. Because a lot of times, even Papa Joe, you read the story about him. After all that stuff with Count Basie, the lady at the hospital was like, yo, if you don't have some money today, we putting them out. And they meant it. Wow. Those people are somebody to us, but, you know, to the general society, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
He's just an ordinary person. They treat him just like any other patient. If he don't have the money, he's got to get up out of here. Yeah. And Frank Sinatra ended up paying his hospital bill.
Wow.
Yeah, so stuff like that, you know, and then the guys didn't own nothing. That's another aspect, you know, of who owned the music. They made it, but, you know, in the end, you know, a lot of the guys didn't eat off the proceeds of their work. And that's just like slavery was. I mean, we picked the cotton, you know what I'm saying, and got a small percentage.
Yeah.
So it's like musical sharecropping. You make the music, they own it. And drugs kind of played a role in that. And see, in Upright Bass, now we got to show me another book that puts the drugs in the studio.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Where the actual producer of the day wanted to see my father stick a needle in his arm. He never got another prestige day after that.
Yeah.
That's how interwoven drugs was into the jazz business. And most guys close rank. They're not going to talk to you about that. You can't go to Harold Mayburn and ask him how much dope was Lee Morgan using when he was in his group. You know what I'm saying? He would be offended by the question.
Yeah.
I'm not much less answer it. He would be offended by the very question itself.
Yeah.
And you would know not to expect the answer because you won't get one. They close ranks on that, unfortunately, because there's lessons that can be learned that need to be passed on.
In this journey to write the book and to get to know your father, I mean, you know your father in different veins as a musician the public knew, as your father, and what other, any other incarnation that you knew, but what was the most surprising things that you discovered about your father along this journey? Maybe things you didn't realize, new things. What did you learn about him?
You know what, to be honest with you, I followed him. Like I said, when we were driving in the car with the listening to the radio, this thing began when I was like a kid, because I was always curious about this music and asking questions. And so there weren't that many gray areas, because whether it was an involvement with the Jazz Foundation, all of those things, I kept on abreast of those things. I was one of his children that was really interested in his career and kind of followed it, you know, for the last like 40 years. So there weren't that many, surprises actually, you know, because a lot of these stories I had heard before. And that's why I wanted to actually document them. Like the Red Garland story, he actually told, when we were just sitting around, what was that, 1992, he turned 60. And he had a party, so Calvin Newborn came over, George Coleman, who else? Lou Donaldson was there, and they had a little cookout, and he told that story, and Harold Mayburn was literally in tears, you know, because he gestured and was walking how Red Garland was walking, and I remember he said, that should be in the book. Little did I know, that's exactly where, you know, it ended up, you know. So there wasn't too much, because it wasn't like I just decided to investigate him, and I was like a hip-hopper, and my father died, and I decided to just do a book on him. This started as a living project. And he knew he probably wouldn't be here to see it to its completion, but it started as a living project. And I was always curious about his career. So a lot of this stuff I had actually known, you know. And then my grandmother, I spoke to her about him, and my aunt, Dorothy, who's quoted heavily in the book, she was the only sibling that really was into the music, that followed his career. And so we had heard me in particular, I heard a lot of those stories, you know. And so there wasn't that much new information, to be honest with you. Because this book was started, you know, many years before it was actually written. Just like I didn't know going to the Blue Mitchell tribute in 1979, I just had a feeling that it was a special night. And I confirmed it because I asked Virgil Jones, I asked John Faddis, and just judging from their response and reaction, you know, I knew it was a historical night, you know. And so, yeah, I've been questioning him all along. I'm probably one of his most consistent interviewers over the years, in an informal sense, anyway.
Yeah. So, you know, the one thing that's beautiful about this book that I've read is that there's so many vignettes of so many musicians. When you hear about a cat like this that's been around for so long, it's mind-boggling how many avenues they've etched in this world of jazz. But my question to you is this. Mm-hmm. For those that listen to this interview that are curious about this book, how would you verbally sell this book? Why is this book important? Why does this need to be in the annals of jazz history for somebody to experience his life?
Man, that's such a great question. Take, for instance, Miles Davis's Curiosity. You know Miles Davis was not given to compliments, right? He writes a book 2 years before he dies. He doesn't mention the Pittsburgh musicians. He doesn't mention the musicians from South Central. He wondered about the musicians from Memphis because he hired 3 of them in 1963. Frank Strozier, Harold Mayburn, and George Coleman. He kept George Coleman. So now, how did they develop? Miles wondered about it. He said, I wondered what school they would come out of, down there in Memphis, that all of them came up here playing so well. So one thing, it gives you insight into the process of their development, because they're still calling Memphis the home of the blues. What about jazz? You got George Coleman, Frank Strozier, Charles Lloyd, Phineas Newborn, Everett Bradshaw, Lewis Smith, Mason Wood. I mean, the list goes on and on. So how does that explain their development as jazz musicians in Memphis? So you'll get insight in the process of their development coming up, aspiring to be jazz musicians in an environment that demanded that they play the blues. They had to sneak jazz into the blues to practice it on gigs. Because in Memphis, it wasn't really a jazz town. It was a blues town. Number 2, you learn the true story of Phineas Newborn. Most of the accounts you read, online or offline, he was a pianist that just went crazy and fell off the scene. Right? Yes. But the nervous breakdown was precipitated by a beef he had with the industry. He wanted to own himself, and they wanted to own him. And so he thought he could change his record company, booking agent, manager, but they went sons down and shut him out of the industry, period. Number 3, you learned about Oscar Dennard. You could ask John Handy's alive. I interviewed him. Norman Simmons said he met him in 1950. And he said he played boogie-woogie on a level that he hasn't heard before or since. Randy Weston heard him. And so there's some people still alive that could tell you about his greatness. But for the first time, you get insight into Oscar Dennard, this great pianist that cut Phineas Newborn Jr. with one hand in Memphis. And I mean, history hasn't recorded anybody that vanquished Phineas in the piano battle. And he did it twice, and he did it once with one hand. And Phineas Newborn, for the rest of his life, named him as one of his favorites. By the way, Art Tatum heard him when he was 15, Oscar Dennard, and said he got everything at 15. So that's one of the untold stories. And he died tragically. Like, they just celebrated International Day, right? International Jazz Day, April 29th. Well, those guys were in Poland in 1960, not only playing, but teaching other musicians. They did the same in Russia, but when you read any book on jazz and diplomacy, you don't expect to see their names. To give you an example, there's a documentary called Jazz Ambassadors. I went to the premiere at the Smithsonian with my book in my hand, and I asked the gentleman who put together the documentary, he had $500,000 in money and carte blanche on libraries all across the country, starting with the Library of Congress, the biggest library in the world. And I said, well, I could understand you not covering my father with the New York Jazz Quartet, but Mitchell and Ross, their account was documented in Call to Assembly. You familiar with that book?
Yeah.
Yeah, so he documented that in the chapter of Call to Assembly. And also, it was well broadcast. In fact, I pulled up the Jet article, the original Jet article, on my phone from 1959. You couldn't find that with $500,000? It's kind of, you know what I'm saying? It makes me just wonder, like, really, I mean, if I could pull it up on my phone right in this room, and you had $500,000 and you don't know they went there in 1959, right? Yeah. Another example, and then I'll move on. Cyril Moscow, I just met him in New York at the Jazz Congress. You can tune into YouTube right now, Jazz in Russia. Him and Larry Applebaum did a seminar on jazz in Russia, I think at the Library of Congress. He said between 1927 in Russia, when Benny Payton's Jazz Kings came there, and 1962, there was nothing happening there, jazz-wise. See? So that eliminates my father and them being there in 1960 and Mission and Roth in 1959. And I showed him the book and showed him the picture. He said, oh, yeah, I knew about them. So why didn't you say that in your panel discussion? I didn't ask him that. You know what I'm saying? I was just curious to know. He looked and said, oh, I know all about them. And then on the website, the Russian Jazz website, you find their names there. But when it comes time to documentary and books, all of a sudden people get Alzheimer's. And I'm not trying to advance a conspiracy theory, but I've just seen it too much and in too many different areas for it to be a coincidence. Yeah. You get to hear his story of becoming a Muslim. In the 50s, in New York, there was already a beef with the Muslims and the Jews. I wasn't there. Dizzy Gillespie said it. I put it in the book. Lou Donaldson said it. And this is before my father got there. They talk about in the 40s. Idris Suleiman said it. And Olin Tunji. So I get my father's account, and it's corroborated by some non-Muslims that observed. So he said basically half of his work went out the window. Okay? So that's another thing. Look at what Muhammad Ali went through in the 60s. Okay? Now, I wanted to say one more thing about Author Dennard. He died. He's an international jazz martyr. Duke Ellington, his whole band came back, didn't they? Louis Armstrong, Helen Humes is another one. She died in Africa. Did you know that? Touring with Louis Armstrong in 1960.
Wow.
So I have to add her too. These are international martyrs that actually died in another country representing this music. You know, and so I think they should be honored or at least recognized because that's the ultimate sacrifice. And so you get to and a lot of people didn't talk about that conversion to Islam and the consequences because a lot of jazz musicians became Muslims, but they kept their Christian names. Why did they do that? You know, Koitana Suleiman Saud. Did you know that? That was his Muslim name. Why doesn't he use that name?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it had consequences. You know what I'm saying? Half of my father's work went out the window. And I put it in the book. He would get calls in the middle of the night. You reclaim that George Joyner identity, you'll find your work picking up. Then the whole story about dope. Nobody talks about it. Like I've just pointed out, Papa Joe told him and Paul Jenkins, it was a system. It was an organized way that they strung out musicians. And they used women a lot of times. They would put it in your drink. You would go to the bathroom, tap, 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 you know, and they would hang out with you and you wake up sick and say, hey, take some of this. Problem solved. Now you're a junkie. And it happened to so many people. He's one of the few musicians that escaped that. That's another thing. So you're getting a sober-minded perspective on the influence of drugs and alcohol in the jazz business. You get insight into his work at the Jazz Foundation, the Austin Bandstand, insight into how to develop as a jazz musician, certain little just basic tidbits. And a lot of times the gems are in those basic tidbits about how to swing and having a basic conception of what this music does and what the impact it's supposed to have on the listener. So those are four, and then Ahmed Jamal, he almost died. The year I was born. In fact, he almost didn't get to see me. They got arrested in Suriname. A lot of people don't know that story. It was so traumatic for Mr. Jamal that he decided he's never talked about that publicly. But you're getting a first-hand account, not just from my father, but from Frank Gant, because I interviewed Frank Gant as well. And they barely made it out of there. And so my father had went through a similar thing in Africa, so he told them, if y'all want to make it out alive, just let me handle it. And so they were able to, finagle their way out of that situation. Yeah, a lot of people don't know, like, just the life chances, or the life risk that they took just on the road. They ran into the mafia in Newport, Kentucky. They lived in a plane that almost crashed, And so you're getting a little insight into the music that you wouldn't otherwise have. So when you listen, you could listen with another kind of mindset, knowing the story behind the music, as CH1 says. Look how they do that for rock and rap. It would be nice to see a lot more of those for jazz.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So those are the main kind of takeaways from this book that makes it different. You're not going to find this anywhere. Anybody that tells you they know the story of Author Dennard from start to finish, they are lying. Or Phineas Newborn. So this is not another Duke Ellington book or another book on Louis Armstrong, and everybody complained about the Ken Burns documentary that they kept focused on Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong and had to exclude a lot of other people because they gave the lion's share time to them. And so, and a lot of the cats from that generation didn't talk, if you notice, you know. And it's rare to get a sideman's perspective, too. Look at the books. They always, whoever had the horn out front, the singer, Billie Holiday, Sarah, Dexter got a book out now, right? Yeah. But guess whose voice you don't hear? You don't hear no perspective on the musicians that played with him. What do they got to say about Dexter? With Rufus Reed, he just came and played with me and came to my book launch in New York because he told that story about my father helping him, you know, to make his decision to become a professional jazz musician. And that's a story him and his wife just told me off the cuff in 1995. You know what I'm saying? This little stuff you pick up. I didn't know that. They volunteered that story, and he came and he retold that story again at St. Peter's Church in New York. But you want to hear from the musician, what was it like playing with that cat? What was he demanding? You know, what kind of musical wisdom did he pass on to you about what you need to work on, about what he needed to get, you know, the proper foundation he needed to express himself. So a lot of times you don't get their perspective. And that sideman term has to be, you know, cast to the wind once and for all because it's real. Everybody's up there making that music together. If I'm lying, then show me the solo album of any of those cats. Where's Miles Kinda Blue that he did solo, just taking a horn in the studio by himself? See, so it's all of them making that music together. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And a lot of times it's not treated like that because everybody talks about the person whose name's on the album cover, you know, and they treat the other guys like they're just wallpaper. Like they could have been anybody. And if you think if anybody disagrees, just you got ears, you compare. You pay to compare the chemistry of those groups, you know, to the other groups that, you know, came. And you could just take anybody. You could take Ahmed Jamal for instance. Just let your ears do the comparison. Which one appeals to you? That group stayed together for 12 years. A trio? How many groups lasted like that through that period with no personnel change for like over a decade? And there's a rapport that you could only get through that kind of extended, you know, relationship over years. It takes that. And so, that's another perspective on, because a lot of musicians don't want to write their memoir. You know, they want to, you know, they're going to take the information to the grave, which is a disservice to all of us, really. Because sometimes that information, your experiences should be shared with other people that they may learn from them. And so my father was very open. If he met you and you came to the club and you asked him a question, he wouldn't go outside like a lot of musicians do. That's their sacred time, man. He would sit down and talk to you from the beginning of the break to the end, if he found you sincere and curious about this music. So that's another thing. You don't, you know, how many books? Ron Carter got a book. Brian Toff wrote his memoirs. I counted them. Scott LaFaro's sister wrote his book. And who else? Charlie Mingus, Pops Foster. I'm just dealing with books on bass players. You could count them on two hands. And so that's going to be the main takeaway. You're not going to read this nowhere else. And you're not going to Google it. And if you just put that book down and just Google my father's name and you compare. You compare what's on the internet to what's in that book. Yeah. Even if you just search Oscar Dennard. So like I said, it's not just a run-of-the-mill. You keep seeing books on Miles. They're the same. Have you noticed that? I even put myself on the line and said, we don't need another book on Duke Ellington. Let's cover somebody else. Because it's so easy to write a book because there's so much information there. There's such a vast, you know, wealth of information on Duke Ellington that a researcher could draw from that you could easily write a book on Duke Ellington because so much research has been done on him, and justifiably so. But there's so many other great people that, you know, fall through the cracks, and you never really get to hear about their story. Like, you know, the story about Roy Haynes that I put in the book, about Sonny Rollins firing the band. Yep. I walked up to Roy Haynes in 2010. We talking about 1957 this happened. He didn't scratch his head. He didn't say, let me see. He said it happened. He said the only thing I couldn't remember was it was Gil Coggins on piano.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I talked to other people just to kind of confirm. Not that I doubted my father, but sometimes as a researcher, it's just nice to get confirmation, you know. And so I walked on, and he remembered, you know. Just like Freddie Hubbard, a friend of mine walked into Freddie Hubbard. Him and Lee Morgan had a cutting contest in 1971. A lot of people don't know about that. I wish I could have put it in the book, but I couldn't find a way to fit it in there. And they say, man, Lee Morgan blew down the house. And Freddie tried high notes. He tried to play Spanish. The audience like, bring Lee Morgan back out. Lee. They were shouting his name. And my friend asked Freddie Hubbard about that in 2001. He didn't scratch his head. He said, Lee Morgan just played better than me. He got me that night. So that's the kind of memories these guys have. If you catch them, you know what I'm saying, when they're cogent. And I remember Yusef Lateef, just to give you one more, Frank Gant told me that he had a cutting contest with Sonny Rollins in Detroit. So I asked Yusef Lateef here again in 2001. He came to the house. I said, yeah, Frank Gant told me that you and Sonny Rollins had a cutting contest in Detroit. He said, yeah, it was 1957. We played Cherokee for an hour and a half. Here again, he didn't scratch his head. I don't know. And he added to it. He gave me the tune, the time, and the time they played it, and how long they played it, you know.
Yeah.
So just stuff like that. I couldn't ask him that now. I couldn't confirm that now.
Yeah.
So that's the main takeaway about this book. This is rare jazz history that you're not going to get anywhere else. I mean, people know bits and pieces of the history, you know. Just like stuff Monty told me, I didn't know. Oh, here's an answer to your question. I didn't realize that Monty Alexander had played with my father before he played with Ahmed Jamal. I thought that they worked later.
Yeah.
But he worked with Monty Alexander in 1963. That's one thing that shocked me that I didn't. All these years, I didn't know that. I didn't learn that until 2011. Wow. And so that's what this is. Not just an ordinary book. And it deals with spirituality. It deals with education. Because they like these narratives of the junkie jazz musician that didn't take care of his kids, that traveled all over the world, didn't take care of business. His best moments were on the bandstand. After that, run. Right?
Yeah.
Their lives are wrecked. They're not fathers. This man was a father. You see what I'm saying? So that's why sometimes this book wouldn't be as popular as some of the other ones, because it's not about a junkie, alcoholic jazz musician that was irresponsible and exploited. They love those kind of narratives.
Yeah.
In fact, Billy Joel's book was canceled because it didn't have enough sex, drugs, and alcohol. Do you know about that?
No.
He had to return the advance.
Wow.
Because they said he thought they wanted to know about his songwriting process and his parents, you know, and his musical development. They said, nah, we need sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's what we paying you for. He said, I'm sorry, I didn't have that kind of lifestyle. Yeah. And so the whole deal was scrapped. He returned the advance money, and he gave the would-be author the permission to just go ahead and write, your own book, which he did. And so that's like, they want those Hollywood kind of narratives. And then just look at the Green Book, the movie The Green Book.
Yeah.
This man, Don Shirley, had family alive. They weren't consulted at all. They took the liberty to completely distort his image, and they didn't get a dime. Wow. You hear me? Not one dime. And this is the man they talked to that they knew, and they completely distorted it. See? Just to titillate the audience. And we've lost too much history, to, especially in this music, to allow that to happen. Did you see If Beale Street Could Talk?
No.
It opens up Beale Street in New Orleans. Let me say it again. Beale Street in New Orleans. What's wrong with that?
Yeah. It's not New Orleans.
Could you imagine us saying, well, we were on Bourbon Street in Memphis, and nobody said nothing. Nobody corrected. What do you think Winton would have said if they had a book on New Orleans, you know what I'm saying, or Memphis, and they put Bourbon Street in Memphis? Yeah. Uh-huh. And our history's been so distorted, it may seem like, it's Hollywood, they're just taking a liberty. No, but with our history, it's been so distorted and colored, Yeah. And so, and my father fought for the music, man. He paid dearly, man. He talked about the racism. He talked about the drugs. He talked about the incompetent critics that ruined careers because they personally didn't like what the people were playing or they were trying to promote somebody else. And he was he was kind of persona non grata, you know. And so I'm experiencing some discrimination now, you know, to be honest with you.
Sure.
But unlike my father, I'm not going to be long-suffering. And this is the first time I'm going to do this for a little while longer. This is not going to be a lifestyle for me because I don't feel like I should have to go through that. I'm not going to go through being frustrated with the jazz world. That's why I kind of wanted to document my music, document this book. If the jazz world don't bite, then, you know, I'll move on to some other genre.
Yeah.
And I mean that. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
It took 15 years and $10,000. There was a lot of sacrifice involved. I did a couple of GoFundMe campaign, got minimal financial support. This was strictly out of pocket, you know.
Yeah.
And I want to be able to encourage other writers and let them know this the potentially lucrative market for writing books. But that's all going to depend on, you know, the response to this one. Because there's not a lot of jazz books coming out.
No.
There's no I mean, there's so few, all of them should be reviewed. They don't even have the luxury of really choosing, you know.
Yeah.
Jazz, to give you an example, the Jazz Times reviewed 2 books last year. And I sent them 2. And they've yet to review Upright Bass.
Wow.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I think this is a vital read. I think it's a beautiful story full of just so much that any jazz fan should see. And your CD's phenomenal. So thank you for opening up about this book. Thank you for giving the world the stories and your music. I appreciate your time, man.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in Memphis, New York, Kansas City, and spots all over the globe, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Muneer for his time, his book, the stories, and the music. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.